This is Terrence Andre Banks with Information Age Financial Solutions coming to you again about student loans. I haven't done any videos in a while about it, but I came across this fantastic article, The Inescapable Weight of My 100,000 Student Debt. It comes from The Guardian, and I'm going to put the link inside the description aspect of this video. And if I made the point before in some past videos of questioning the old adage of going to college, especially when the cost of it is outweighing the benefits in a lot of cases. Now, I know a lot of people might disagree with that, but there's other ways of just moving to generate wealth, and maybe thinking about, maybe this article may help, get you to think in a different place about what we've been led to believe is the pillar of generating, going to the middle class by getting that college education. Let me dive right in. This is a pretty lengthy article, so I'm going to read a good portion of it, but then I encourage you at your leisure to go take a look at it for yourself. The inescapable weight of my $100,000 student debt. First of all, the number is astronomical, but let's go on. Halloween 2008, about 6 weeks after Lehman Brothers collapsed, my mother called me from Michigan to tell me that my father had lost his job in the sales department of Viston, an auto parts supplier for Ford. 2 months later, my mother lost her job working for the city of Troy, a suburb about half an hour from Detroit. From there, our lives seemed to accelerate, the terrible events compounding fast enough to elude immediate understanding. By June, my parents, unable to find any work in the state where they spent their entire lives, moved to New York, where my sister and I were both in school. A month later, the mortgage on my childhood home went into default. After several months of unemployment, my mother got a job in New York City. Now, let me just stop right here, not because the story is not good. It's just sometimes you may think that you can't relate to this, but unfortunately, this has been a problem for a lot of Americans who face this particular situation. If you haven't counted yourself to be fortunate in that, I haven't been fortunate, but I never experienced that as well, and I'm always looking for different opportunities. But this could happen to you. So let's continue on. And he gives a backdrop in terms of explaining his point. In the summer 2010, I completed my studies at New York University, where I received a BA and MA in English literature with more than $100,000 of debt, for which my father was a guarantor. My father was still unemployed, and my mother had been diagnosed with an aggressive form of breast cancer. She continued working, though her employer was clearly perturbed that she would have to take off every Friday for chemotherapy. To compensate for the lost time on Monday, she rode early buses in the city from the Bronx, where after months of harrowing uncertainty, my parents had settled. She wanted to be in the office first thing. On January 2011, Chase Bank took full possession of the house in Michigan. Our last ties were severed by an email from my father received from the realtor who had tried and failed to sell the property, telling him he could now cancel the utilities. In May, I got a freelance contract with a newspaper that within a year would hire me full time, paying me after taxes roughly $900 every 2 weeks. You got $100,000 of student loan debts, but $900 every 2 weeks. It's crazy. It's not crazy because the individual, he's just being honest and telling you his particular situation. I wonder how many other people face these particular problems and just don't have the courage enough to discuss it. In September 2011, my parents, and I also want you to notice the dates here. We're not talking about 2008 when the crisis. This is 3 years after it. So, continue on. My parents were approved for bankruptcy, and in October, due to paperwork error, their car was repossessed in the middle of the night by creditors. Meanwhile, the payments for my debt, which had been borrowed from a variety of federal and private lenders, most prominent Citibank, totaled about $1,100 a month. Now, I've been incapacitated by debt for a decade. The delicate balance act that my family and I perform in order to make a payment each month has become the organizing principle of our lives. I'm just one of 44 million borrowers in the U.S. who owe a total of more than $1.4 trillion of student loan debt. I'm glad he said more than $1.4 trillion. Last count, it was over 1.5 and continuing to go. This number is almost incomprehensibly high, and yet it continues to increase with no sign of stopping. Legislation that might help families in financial hardship has failed in Congress. Why not? Because part of GDP is based on continuing with the student loan number, because it's part of the way the government runs their business in terms of giving you a false sense of hope and reality, even for our financials. The bill introduced in May 2000 Discard Students and Loans Bankruptcy Act, which would undo changes made to the bankruptcy code in the early 2000s. Stalled in committee, despite all evidence that student loan debt is a national crisis. The majority of the U.S. government The only organization with the power to resolve the problem refuses to acknowledge its severity. My debt was the result in equal measure of a chain of rotten luck and a system that is abject failure by design. My parents never lived extravagantly. In the first years of marriage, my father drove a cab. When they had children, and my father started a career in the auto industry, became firmly middle class, never wanting for anything, even taking vacations once a year to places like Myrtle Beach or Miami. Still, there was usually just enough money to cover the bills, car, leases, a mortgage, groceries. My sister and I both attended public school. The cost of things was... kind of clicked out here. The cost of things was discussed constantly. In my freshman year of high school, I lost my yearbook, which cost $40. My mother was nearly wept. My mother very nearly wept. College, which cost roughly $50,000 a year, was the only time that money did not seem to matter. We'll find a way to pay for it, my parents said repeatedly, and if we couldn't pay for it immediately, there was always a bank willing to give us a loan. This was true even after my parents had both lost their jobs. Now, this is what's so striking about this. They will continue to give on a loan regardless of the fact, because the banks can always backstop it by getting the government to pay it. And they know that they can't be absolved of bankruptcy. That's why they continue to give you these loans. And no one questions this stuff. This is, and this is the sad part. That's why I'm putting so much emphasis on my channel. Between the millennials and the baby boomers, you cripple them, because the parents of this individual is probably a baby boomer. And they're straddled with the student loan debts, which is just even more depressing, even reading it. But it's worth paying attention to. We'll continue on. We'll find a way to pay for it, my parents said repeatedly, and if we couldn't pay for it immediately, there was always a bank willing to give us a loan. This was true even if my parents had lost their jobs amid the global financial meltdown. Like many well-meaning but misguided, Addie said that, baby boomers, neither of my parents received an elite education, but they nevertheless believed that an expensive school was not a waste of money. It was the key to a better life for their children. They continued to put faith in this falsehood even at the previously unmanageable financial loss, and so we continued spending money that we didn't have, money that banks kept giving to us. I spent a great deal of my time during the last decade shifting the blame for my debt. Whose fault was it? My devoted parents encouraged me to attend a school that I couldn't afford. The banks, which should have never loaned money to people who clearly couldn't pay it back to begin with, continues exploiting the hope of families like mine, and quick to exploit us further once the hope had disappeared. Or was it my fault for not having the foresight to realize it was a mistake to spend roughly $200,000 on a school where, in order to get my degree, I kept a journal about reading Virginia Woolf? Sample patch, which surely blew my mind at the time. We're interested in facts because we're interested in myth. We're interested in my myth insofar as myth constructs facts. The problem, I think, runs deeper than blame. The foundation myth of an entire generation of Americans was the false promise that education was priceless, that it was valuable, was above beyond its cost. I'll repeat that again. The foundational myth of an entire generation of Americans was the false promise that education was priceless, that its value was above or beyond its cost. College was not a right or a privilege, but an inevitability on the way to a meaningful adulthood. What an irony that decisions I made about college when I was 17 had derailed such a goal. Whew. Well said. Mouthful, but well said. After the dust settled on the collapse of the economy on my family's life, we found ourselves in an impossible situation. We owed more each month than we could collectively pay, and so we wrote letters to Citibank's mysterious P.O. box address in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, begging for help, letters that I doubt ever met a human being. We grew to accept Citibank as a detestable Moloch that we feared and hated, but we were made to worship. The letters began to compromise a diary for my father in particular, a way to communicate a private anguish that he mostly bottled up. As he was storing up for later, in one letter addressed, Dear City, he pleaded for a longer-term plan with lower monthly payments. He describes how my mother's mounting medical bills, as well as Chase Bank's collection on our foreclosed home, had forced the family into bankruptcy, which provided no protection in the case of private student loans. We were not asking in the end for relief or forgiveness, but merely to pay the amount we could still barely afford. This is an appeal to Citi asking you to work with us on this loan. He wrote to no one at all. Finally, at the beginning of May 2012, my father started writing to the office of Congressman Joseph Crowley, who represented the district in the Bronx, where my parents had relocated. In one of those letters, he described watching Too Big to Fail, an HBO film about the financial crisis which had come out several months earlier. My parents lost every asset they had, but they still subscribed to HBO, which became more than TV for them and symbolic relic of their former class status. Wow. The recession was over, officially anyway, and people who had not suffered its agonies were already profiting from its memory. Recession films often took place in the gleaming offices of hedge funds and investment banks, with attractive celebrities offering sympathetic portrayals of economists and bankers. Zachary Quinto in 2011's Margin Call, for instance, plays a rocket scientist turned risk analyst with a heart of gold, a do-gooder who discovers that his employers had leveraged itself to the edge of bankruptcy. These films often depicted figures who experienced little to no repercussions for their roles in leading the country into a recession, who abused the misfortune of people like my parents, unmentionables who owed more on their houses than what they paid for them, and of course rarely featured in the story at all. My father described himself and my mother to Crowley as the poster children for this entire financial event, by which he meant Americans who seemed to have done everything right on paper, but in doing so contributed to their own downfall. By the time he wrote to Crowley, my father was working again, but it had taken him 2 years to find another job, which paid him much less money. After his run on financial calamity, he knew better than to believe anything good would last. We are in our 60s, and I figure when we get into our mid-70s, life will become difficult again, he wrote. Now, if you see any of my videos on pension crisis, this is definitely the case, as well as I did a recent video on bankruptcy, calling that they the largest group to go in that. So it's really sad, but it just shows you where we're at and how we need to be really prepared and start doing things differently. I'll continue on, and then I'm going to probably stop here to encourage you to read it on your own. Crowley office wrote back, it was the first time in about 2 years that a person responded to our correspondence with encouragement or something like it. Someone who worked for his office in Washington helped to arrange a conference call with the government liaisons from Citigroup to discuss a different payment plan. The monthly payments of Citi were then more than $800 a month, and we were trying to talk them into letting us pay the loan over a longer period at a rate of about $400 a month. These terms were reasonable enough, but the response to this request was like an automated message brought to life. We are precluded from a regulatory perspective from being able to do what you're asking. Each of the representatives said what made these exchanges more ridiculous was the fact that Citibank was in the process of retreating from the student loan market by selling off my debt to Discover Financial, who would give us the same response. We were nothing to these companies but a number in a database, and they fully controlled our fates. I used to wonder if the people who worked for these lenders had families on their own, and they would find themselves bankrupt, wondering where they were going to live. Most of all, I wondered what they would do if their own children had to take out loans to pay for college. After 10 years of living with the fallout of my own decisions about my education, I've come to think of my debt as like an alcoholic relative from whom I am estranged, but who shows up to ruin happy occasions. But when I first got out of school and the reality of how much money I owed finally struck me, the debt was more of a constant, explicit preoccupation, a matter of life or death. I studied English because I wanted to be a writer. I never had expectation of becoming rich. I didn't care about money. My MA fed an intellectual curiosity that eventually led me to newspapers, and I don't regret that my translation of the dream of the road from Old English to contemporary vernacular was not a terribly marketable or even applicable skill. And see, that's the thing here. You know, when you're reading this and you're seeing this, you may have in your mind, well, he should have known better, stuff like that. Most people don't. They'll continue taking on these loans and not questioning. I used to work in the nonprofit sector when the student loans started up, and I was one of the first people to come up with these. Well, we started introducing different information about student loans. But by the time we started really introducing it, people were taking out 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80. It was common for me to see $75,000 as a student loan payment. And no one would even question, even if it was federal loans, how are you going to pay for it? Everyone in that sector was open, they were hoping for student loan forgiveness. But this is insanity. And, and this is just showing just what we continue on until this debt binge ends. So I'm going to read a little bit more, and then again, as I mentioned, I'm going to stop. Wrote for any class of French, he even took on more classes. Well, you should care about money, and that's the reason why I'm reading this. I understand how now the extent which I was going the most overeducated group of young adults in human history. Absolutely. Still following completion of this degree, I enrolled for an evening class in French at New York's Cooper Union, as that deferred my having to start paying off the debt, at the cost of the new class was cheaper than the monthly payments I would have to make. Once I could no longer delay and the payments became a question, echoed through my head from the moment that day began, and often jolted me awake at night. I would look at the number on my paycheck and obsessively subtract my rent, the cost of a carton of eggs, and a can of beans, my sustenance during the first lean years of this mess and the price of a loan payment. The question was, what will you do when the money from the paycheck is gone? I never arrived at the answer to this question. At my lowest points, I began fantasizing about dying. Not because I was suicidal, because death would have meant relief from having to come up with the answer. My life, I felt, had been assigned a monetary value. I knew what I was worth and I couldn't afford it, so all the better to cash out early. Now, I'm going to stop here. Really encourage you to take a look at the story, kind of dive into it, finish reading it. It's pretty lengthy, as I mentioned before, and it goes on because he breaks down the payments and exactly what he's doing, and just the narrative that has not been questioned about these student loans. So if you're questioning, if you're getting ready to go to college, and this is right about the time people get ready to start, please look at the numbers. Numbers matter. And education, find out the value of what you're going to do that you're taking a career for, and see if it matches up to the amount of loans that you're going to take. This is the least you can do. And then, look at our channel and look at, as I try to put out from time to time, just different ways of generating more income. And you don't have to be so weighed down by this. Until my next video, please subscribe, leave some comments. I'm out.